In 68 AD, the most powerful man on earth was running barefoot through the darkness. No guards, no servants, no royal escort, just a terrified 30-year-old stumbling through back roads outside Rome, hiding his face, listening for the sound of approaching horses. 12 hours before this moment, he had been emperor of the world. Now, the Senate had voted on exactly how he would die. He would be stripped naked, locked into a wooden fork, and beaten with rods until he stopped breathing. He couldn't face it, so he pressed a blade to his own throat, and his hands were shaking so badly that a secretary had to help him finish the job. His final words were not about his empire, not about his armies, not about his legacy as a ruler. He said, "What an artist dies in me." That one sentence explains everything about how Rome lost a dynasty that had ruled for 100 years. But before we get there, if you find this kind of history fascinating, go ahead and hit that like button and subscribe so you never miss stories like this one. Now, this story doesn't begin with fire and chaos. It begins with money and a plate of mushrooms. In October of 54 AD, Emperor Claudius sat down to dinner. By morning, he was dead. The palace moved fast. Before sunrise, the Praetorian Guard, the only military force permitted inside Rome, marched a 16-year-old boy to their barracks and declared him emperor. His name was Nero Claudius Caesar Augustus Germanicus. He had never fought a battle. He had never governed a province. He had never commanded a single soldier. He sat on the throne of the greatest empire on earth for one reason. His mother, Agrippina the Younger, had spent an entire decade engineering that exact outcome. She had married Claudius. She had convinced him to adopt Nero over his own biological son, Britannicus. And when the timing felt right, the mushrooms appeared on the dinner table. No trial was ever held. No evidence was ever formally examined. Just the timing, and the result. Nero took the throne. Agrippina stood directly behind it, and for the first 5 years, something that nobody expected actually happened. Rome functioned. Nero's tutor, the Stoic philosopher Seneca, along with the Praetorian prefect Burrus, essentially ran the government while Nero wore the crown. Taxes were reviewed. Provincial governors were held accountable. The Senate was consulted on legislation, which had become little more than a formality under Claudius. The treasury was healthy. The borders were stable. Nero delivered public speeches written by Seneca that spoke of justice and restraint. But underneath all of that, a problem was growing that the public simply could not see. Nero had absolutely no interest in governing. He had grown up surrounded by Greek poetry, music, theater, and artistic competition. He practiced the lyre for hours every day. He studied vocal technique with the seriousness of a professional performer. He composed verses and performed them for small audiences of courtiers. None of that was illegal. None of it was even unusual for a wealthy Roman. The problem was that Nero wasn't simply a wealthy Roman, he was emperor. And that distinction mattered enormously, because the Roman treasury was not the emperor's personal fortune. It was the financial engine of an empire, stretching from Britain to Syria, the machine that paid 300,000 soldiers and maintained roads, aqueducts, and grain shipments across the entire Mediterranean world. And Nero had started treating it like a personal account. The spending was still manageable at first. Banquets, performers, lavish gifts for favorites. But the direction was visible to anyone paying attention. Seneca was paying attention. Burrus was paying attention. And so was Agrippina. She had placed Nero on that throne, believing she could control him. The moment she realized she couldn't, she made a move. She began publicly supporting Britannicus, Claudius's biological son, the boy Nero had displaced. Britannicus was 14 years old, but he had a legitimate claim to power, and Agrippina was sending a very clear signal to the Senate and the Guard that she had the ability to swap one emperor for another. In February of 55 AD, at a dinner banquet, Britannicus picked up a drink, convulsed violently, and collapsed. He was dead within minutes. Nero told the room it was an epileptic seizure. The body was cremated that same night before dawn in the pouring rain. No physician examined the body publicly. No inquiry was conducted. The ashes were buried without ceremony. Britannicus was 14 years old. The Senate said nothing. The guard said nothing. Agrippina said nothing. Agrippina said nothing, at least not publicly. But everything had shifted. Nero had demonstrated something even Agrippina hadn't fully anticipated. He was willing to eliminate threats at the dinner table, in front of witnesses, and simply dare anyone in the room to object. Agrippina's position changed overnight. She was no longer the power behind the throne. She had become a liability, someone who knew too much, who had her own alliances, and who had just watched what her son would do to a blood relative. Over the following 4 years, Nero systematically stripped her of every piece of influence she had. Her guard detail was removed. She was relocated away from the imperial palace. Her allies at court were quietly reassigned. But Nero didn't stop there. In 59 AD, Agrippina was invited to a festival at Baiae, on the coast near Naples. Nero was warm and affectionate toward her. He embraced her publicly. He personally arranged a specially designated boat for her journey home across the water. That boat had been engineered to collapse at sea. It did exactly that, but Agrippina survived. She swam to shore. When word reached Nero that his mother was still alive, he sent soldiers immediately. They found her at her villa. According to the historian Tacitus, when she saw the soldiers drawing their swords, she pointed to her own abdomen and said, "Strike here, this is where Nero came from." They killed her where she stood. Nero then told the Senate she had been plotting against him and had taken her own life. When the conspiracy was uncovered, nobody believed it. But nobody acted. That was the pattern that would define the next 9 years of his reign. Nero removed a constraint. Rome absorbed the shock. The absence of consequences encouraged the next removal. His first wife, Octavia, daughter of Claudius, was exiled on fabricated adultery charges, then executed. Her severed head was delivered to Nero's new wife, Poppaea, as confirmation. Burrus died in 62 AD, possibly poisoned, though the ancient sources aren't entirely certain. He was replaced by Tigellinus, a man whose loyalty to Nero was absolute and whose interest in actual governance was essentially non-existent. Seneca, watching the trajectory clearly, requested permission to retire. Nero granted it, but kept his estates under constant surveillance. By 63 AD, every single person who had ever restrained Nero's spending, challenged his judgment, or represented any alternative center of power was either dead, exiled, or completely silenced. The treasury was now entirely in Nero's hands, with nothing standing between his impulses and the finances of an empire. And then, in July of 64 AD, Rome caught fire. It started near the Circus Maximus, in the crowded shops and market stalls, packed tightly between the stadium and the Palatine Hill. It burned for 6 days. Then it reignited and burned for 3 more. When it was finally over, 10 of Rome's 14 districts had been damaged. 3 had been completely destroyed. Hundreds of temples, thousands of homes, entire neighborhoods of the densest city in the ancient world, gone. The historian Tacitus, writing about 50 years after the event, records 3 theories that circulated through Rome at the time. First, that it was a terrible accident. Rome was a city of timber-framed buildings, narrow streets, open-flame cooking, and summer heat, and large fires were not unheard of. Second, that Nero had ordered it deliberately, wanting to clear the land for a massive building project and using the fire as cover. This was the version that lodged itself permanently in popular memory. Third, that Nero hadn't ordered it, but had done nothing to stop it, and may have actively interfered with firefighting efforts because the destruction served his plans. The sources disagree with each other, and Tacitus himself refuses to commit to a single explanation. But what matters more than who started the fire is what happened in the weeks immediately after it. Nero did open his palaces and gardens to refugees from the fire. He organized grain distribution across the affected districts. He reduced the price of corn. He introduced new building codes mandating wider streets and fire-resistant construction materials. These were genuine measures. They addressed real problems. They were also completely and utterly overshadowed by what came next. Nero needed a target to absorb public anger, so he selected the Christians, at that time a small, marginal, and poorly understood sect in Rome, entirely distinct from the Jewish community in the eyes of most Romans. They had no political patrons. They were outsiders. They were easy to isolate. Arrests followed. Trials were held, though the standards of evidence murky at best. Convictions came quickly. Then came the punishments. According to Tacitus, some were wrapped in animal skins and torn apart by dogs in public. Others were crucified. Others were coated in pitch and set alight as human torches to illuminate Nero's gardens at night. The spectacle was designed to redirect popular rage away from the emperor and toward a visible enemy. It worked, partially. The rumors about Nero's own involvement in the fire never fully disappeared, but the immediate political crisis was absorbed. What the fire had also created, however, was something Nero had not planned for: opportunity. The heart of Rome was now empty, cleared by disaster, and Nero intended to fill it. What he built on those ruins was not a reconstruction project. It was the Domus Aurea, the Golden House, the complex covered somewhere between 100 and 300 acres of central Rome, depending on which ancient source you follow. For comparison, the Roman Forum, the political, religious, and commercial center of the entire empire, occupied roughly 5 acres. Nero's private residence occupied more physical space than the public heart of Roman civilization. The main structure had over 300 rooms, and none of them appear to have functioned as bedrooms. The entire complex was designed for entertainment, display, and spectacle on an imperial scale. The walls were covered in gold leaf. The ceilings were fitted with ivory panels that could slide open to shower guests with flowers and clouds of perfume. The main dining room featured a rotating mechanism. The ceiling turned continuously, mimicking the movement of the heavens above. An artificial lake was constructed in the valley where the Colosseum would eventually stand. Vineyards and open pastures were laid out around it, creating the illusion of open countryside sitting inside the city itself. At the entrance stood a bronze statue of Nero, over 100 feet tall, modeled on the Colossus of Rhodes. When the palace was completed, Nero reportedly said, "At last, I can begin to live like a human being." That sentence landed in Rome like a detonation, because the city was still rebuilding. Thousands of people were still homeless. Entire districts were still rubble, and the emperor had just seized the most valuable land at the center of the capital. Land that had held temples, public buildings, and private homes for generations, and converted it into a private estate. He hadn't rebuilt Rome. He had simply replaced it with himself. But buildings, no matter how obscene, don't overthrow emperors on their own. What came next did. The Domus Aurea was catastrophically expensive, and the treasury was already strained from fire relief, from years of escalating spending, and from the ongoing costs of maintaining a military empire across 3 continents. Nero needed more money, so he did 2 things. The first was visible. He began confiscating the estates of wealthy senators, and members of the equestrian class. Following the Pisonian conspiracy of 65 AD, a real but poorly organized plot to assassinate him, Nero used the investigation as legal cover for mass property seizures. Over a dozen senators were executed outright or forced to commit suicide. Their estates were absorbed directly into the imperial treasury. Seneca was among them. The man who had written Nero's speeches, shaped his early reign, and spent years attempting to moderate his worst impulses, was ordered to open his own veins. Seneca's wife attempted to die alongside him. Nero's soldiers physically stopped her. The message to the Roman elite was received with perfect clarity. Wealth was no longer safe. Property was no longer secure. Proximity to the emperor was no longer protection. It was exposure. But the Caesar, Condé, thing Nero did was invisible, and it was far more dangerous than any execution. The Roman denarius was the foundation of the entire imperial economy. It paid the legions, it settled commercial debts, it moved through trade routes stretching from Britain to India. Provincial taxes were assessed in denarii. Military bonuses were calculated in denarii. Grain prices were denominated in denarii. Grain prices were denominated for over 200 years, from the time of Augustus through the reigns of Tiberius, Caligula, and Claudius. The denarius had maintained a silver content of roughly 95 to 98%. This wasn't accidental consistency. Augustus had understood that Rome's ability to project power across vast distances depended entirely on soldiers trusting that their pay would hold its value. A legion stationed in Syria and a legion stationed in Germany both had to believe the same coin was worth the same amount. Nero changed this. In approximately 64 AD, the same year as the fire, he reduced the silver content of the denarius from roughly 97% down to 93%. He also reduced the weight of the coin itself. The new coins looked almost identical to the old ones. The imagery was the same. The lettering was the same. Only someone carefully weighing or chemically testing the metal would notice the difference. That was precisely the point. By reducing the silver content, Nero could produce more coins from the same amount of silver. More coins meant more spending capacity, without raising taxes, without conquering new territory, without generating any new real wealth. It was, in mechanical terms, the same principle as printing money, and it worked immediately. The treasury had more liquidity. Building projects continued. The Domus Aurea moved toward completion. But the denarius didn't exist in a vacuum. It existed in an enormous network of trust. Merchants who accepted denarii in Rome also traded with merchants in Egypt, Greece, and the Parthian Empire. Those foreign traders evaluated Roman coins by weight and silver content, not by the face stamped into the metal. When the debased denarii entered circulation in international markets, the exchange rate shifted. Roman coins were worth less abroad. Imported goods became more expensive. The cost of the luxury materials that Nero's building projects demanded, the marble, the gold leaf, the ivory, went up. Inside the empire, the effects were slower, but they compounded steadily over time. Prices rose. The purchasing power of savings eroded. Anyone holding denarii, from soldiers to merchants to ordinary citizens trying to feed their families, found that their money bought a little less with each passing year. But the group that mattered most was the legions. Roman soldiers served for 20 to 25 years. Their pay was fixed by imperial decree. They received a set number of denarii per year, with bonuses for battlefield victories and a lump sum retirement payment at the end of their service. When the silver content dropped, their pay didn't change in nominal terms. They still received the same number of coins, but each coin contained less silver, which meant each coin purchased less grain, less wine, less equipment at the camp market. Their wages had effectively been cut. They simply hadn't been told. And Roman soldiers were not unsophisticated about money. Many came from families with commercial or trading backgrounds. They weighed coins. They noticed when the metal felt slightly lighter, when prices at the market crept upward for no visible reason, when the math of their savings stopped working the way it used to. The debasement didn't cause an immediate mutiny. It didn't need to. What it did was slowly erode the foundational assumption that the emperor coin was trustworthy, and by extension, that the emperor himself was trustworthy. That erosion was invisible on any given day. But it accumulated, and when the crisis finally arrived, it would determine which way the legions turned. By 67 AD, the Roman Empire was running almost entirely on momentum. The treasury was depleted. The senatorial class had been hollowed out by years of executions and confiscations. Provincial governors were under constant pressure to squeeze more tax revenue from populations that were already strained to their limits. And Nero was in Greece. He had left Rome to compete on the Greek festival circuit, the Olympics, the Pythian Games, the Isthmian Games. He entered every competition available to him: chariot racing, singing, poetry, acting. He won every single one. He won because no judge in the ancient world was willing to score against the emperor of Rome. This wasn't surprising behavior for Nero. He had performed publicly in Rome for years, but the Greek tour lasted over a year. During that entire time, the emperor was functionally absent from governance. He did, however, make one major policy announcement while abroad. He declared the entire province of Achaia, Rome's designation for Greece, free from taxation. The Greek cities celebrated enormously. The Roman treasury absorbed another significant blow, and the provinces that had been taxed more and more heavily to compensate for Nero's spending watched as the emperor gave away revenue in exchange for applause. In March of 68 AD, the governor of Gallia Lugdunensis, roughly modern central France, launched an open revolt. His name was Gaius Julius Vindex. He was of Gallic aristocratic descent, a Roman senator, and he governed a province that had been systematically squeezed for increased revenue for years. Vindex didn't claim the throne for himself. He called on the governor of Hisp, Annia Tarraconensis, Servius Sulpicius Galba, to step forward as emperor in Nero's place. Galba was 70 years old, from an ancient patrician family, and had a reputation built over decades for conservative, careful financial management. He was the opposite of Nero in almost every measurable way. Galba initially hesitated. Then he accepted. The revolt itself was disorganized and militarily unsuccessful. The legions of Upper Germany, still loyal to Nero at that point, defeated Vindex's forces at the Battle of Vesontio in May. Vindex took his own life. But the revolt had accomplished something that could not be undone. It had demonstrated publicly that a provincial governor could openly reject the emperor and attract meaningful support. And the legions of Upper Germany, the ones who had just crushed the rebellion, were not celebrating. They had won, but they had received no reward from Nero. Their pay was still denominated in debased coins. Their general had received no recognition from the palace, and they could see that the Eastern legions, the Praetorian Guard, and provincial governors across the empire were all quietly recalculating where their loyalties actually lay. In June of 68 AD, the Praetorian Guard, the force that had made Nero emperor 14 years earlier, received an offer from Galba's agents. The offer was simple: money. Specifically, a donative, the traditional one-time bonus payment that Roman emperors gave the guard upon accession to the throne. Galba promised each guardsman a substantial sum. The guard accepted. On June the 9th, 68 AD, the Senate declared Nero a public enemy, hostis publicus, and formally recognized Galba as emperor of Rome. Nero learned the Senate had turned against him when he woke in the middle of the night at his palace and found his personal guards completely gone. Not killed, not reassigned, simply gone. He sent scares to the barracks. No response came back. He sent for his closest companions. Their houses were empty when the messengers arrived. He went to the barracks himself. The gates were shut and sealed against him. Nero returned to the palace alone. He reportedly called for a gladiator, a soldier, anyone at all willing to kill him, so he wouldn't have to face what the Senate had decreed. Nobody stepped forward. A small group of freedmen, former slaves who had spent years in his household, offered to hide him. One of them, Faur, had a villa 4 miles outside the city. They left the palace on horseback in the darkness. Nero wore a disguise, a cloak with the hood pulled up, a cloth covering his face. He rode in silence, except once, when they passed a group of Praetorian soldiers on the road. One of the soldiers reportedly said, "Those men are chasing Nero." Another said, "What is the news of Nero in the city?" Nero said nothing. They passed. At Phaon's villa, they entered through a hole dug in the rear wall to avoid being seen from the road. Inside, Nero waited in the dark. He could hear riders in the distance. The Senate had dispatched soldiers to find him. The declared sentence was execution in the ancient manner. The wooden fork, the iron rods, the public death. Nero held a dagger. He pressed it against his throat, pulled it back, pressed it again. His hands were shaking too badly to finish it. A secretary stepped forward and helped him. And just like that, the Julio-Claudian dynasty, the line of emperors that had ruled Rome for 100 years, that had built the Pantheon and conquered Britain and transformed a republic into an empire, ended in a borrowed villa 4 miles outside the city, with a frightened man who couldn't even die without help. If you made it this far, you already know this channel is worth subscribing to. Hit that button, and we'll see you in third. Next one.